Imagine a deadly machine, nearly the size of a Volkswagen, armed to the teeth, hurtling at you from 20,000 feet high. It is diving from directly above your windshield at a terrifying relative closing speed of over 600 miles per hour. You are trapped in a glass bubble with barely 3 seconds to react before this machine tears you and your friends to pieces. Within this fleeting window, you must lock the target, calculate the lead angle, and pull the trigger of your heavy machine gun. If your calculations are off by even a fraction of an inch, it is not just your life, the entire 10-man crew faces destruction. This was the desperate reality for every American bomber gunner flying in the freezing skies of Europe in 1943. At that time, hundreds of young airmen were bleeding out in the stratosphere simply because they could not solve this math puzzle. The elite ace pilots of the German Luftwaffe seemed to have unlocked the ultimate cheat code for a brutal, one-sided massacre. They turned the mighty Allied flying fortresses into burning, plunging coffins of twisted metal within those high-altitude clouds. Who could predict that the person to shatter this deadlock was a 19-year-old farm boy from the rural fields of Kansas? Relying on a crazy trick from his family farm, he miraculously caused the destruction of 37 German fighter planes. He snatched the lives of nearly 300 bomber crewmen from death. This is a breathtaking legend buried by the dust of time. Today, let us return to those skies of shrapnel and witness how a farm kid rewrote the history of combat in World War II. The clock runs to October 14, 1943. The watch hands read exactly 8:47 in the morning. On a military airfield in England, a 19-year-old staff sergeant named Raymond Sullivan stood looking up at the heavens. Sullivan had been a gunnery instructor for 7 months, yet his heart was filled with agony and a crushing sense of powerlessness. Watching these young boys no older than himself fly into an unknown fate, he knew that perhaps only half of them would return home. A fatal flaw acted like an invisible meat grinder, frantically consuming the lives of hundreds of American bomber crews over Europe. On the other side of the English Channel, the German Luftwaffe had already bared its sharp fangs to intercept the incoming raid. The German military deployed a colossal interception net consisting of 400 fighter planes to block the massive American raid. This armada included the nimble BF&FW, along with heavy ME destroyers carrying lethal air-to-air rockets. Germans had figured out the exact formula for destroying a B-17 and were executing it with terrifying, unruthless efficiency. We must look back at the events of August that year, which were remembered as a brutal slaughter rather than a typical aerial battle. It was an absolute catastrophe for the United States Army Air Forces, leaving a permanent scar on the history of the entire air war. Out of 376 bombers, 60 aircraft vanished from the formation or were forced to crash land on that dark day. In a single afternoon, 600 American boys were killed in action, missing, or taken prisoner by the ruthless German enemy. When the bloodied survivors returned in shredded aircraft, they reported the same terrifying attack pattern to their superiors. The German fighters appeared like the Grim Reaper, diving suddenly from directly above the front of the heavy bomber formation. They approached head-on at a staggering relative closing speed of over 600 miles per hour during the lethal engagement. Faced with this insane velocity, the American gunners in the nose and top turrets found themselves to be completely helpless. It was not that the American boys lacked courage, they were simply beaten by the laws of physics and the cold reality of math. When a German fighter dove from above the gunners, had only 3 seconds to identify the threat and calculate the lead. Hitting a car-sized target moving as fast as a major league fastball within 3 seconds was a task that was impossible. The official Army Air Forces training manual printed in black and white demanded that all soldiers must lead the target. It instructed them to calculate the closing speed and aim their heavy guns at the future point where the plane would be. Asking a freezing teenager to calculate a precise lead angle in a fraction of a second was a suicidal and cruel joke. The human brain simply cannot process Such incredibly complex three-dimensional angular changes in such a short time. By the time the gunner finished his math, the fast German fighter had already flown through that point and was gone. The elite pilots of the Luftwaffe were fully aware of this American vulnerability and exploited it without any mercy. The German Air Force had spent 2 solid years perfecting this head-on attack doctrine to destroy the heavy bombers. As early as 1940, Major Egan Mayer of the 2nd Fighter Wing had pioneered this deadly combat maneuver. He studied the defensive layout of the bombers and realized that forward guns were useless against high-speed assault. German fighters would dive from high above and open fire at a range of about 800 yards at maximum throttle. They aimed their cannons at the cockpit to assassinate pilots and then broke away before the turrets could even lock. Major Mayer himself personally shot down 102 Allied bombers using primarily this head-on approach. Between January and October of 1943 alone, his 2nd Fighter Wing obliterated over 200 heavy bombers. German pilots arrogantly called this a precision headshot, while terrified American crews simply referred to it as murder. Statistics told a grim story, as 48 of the 60 bombers lost during the August raid were destroyed by frontal attacks. German fighters charged straight in, while American gunners missed time and, again, the pilots were slaughtered in their seats. Since March of 1943, Raymond Sullivan had poured his heart and soul into training 43 young gunners. He taught them everything in the official manuals, including how to track the target and calculate the lead angle smoothly. He watched boys climb into planes and fly to Germany, knowing many were flying to their graves in the cold, high sky. Stories from survivors were identical and heartbreaking, as hitting the fast head on German fighters was simply impossible. Seeing brothers die pushed Sullivan into contemplation, and his mind wandered back to a dusty farm in Hub City, Kansas. His family kept 200 chickens, and their livelihood depended on those birds, surviving the bitter winter nights. Every winter, cunning coyotes would creep from the plains at dusk, moving with blinding speed to snatch the chickens away. In the harsh winter of 1936, Sullivan's father suffered the painful loss of 23 farm chickens. That equated to $46 in income, which was half a month's food for the family gone in a flash of fur and fangs. That year, a 12-year-old Sullivan was handed a Winchester .22 caliber rifle by his hard-working father. The instructions were clear that the chickens were his responsibility, and if the coyotes got them, the family would starve. That very day, his father taught him a lesson nowhere to be found in the thick and bureaucratic Army Air Force's gunnery manuals. His father told him not to aim where the coyote is right now and not to try to guess exactly where it is going to run away. Instead, pick a fixed point on the path. It must take hold your aim there and let the coyote run its body right into your bullet. On November 3, 1936, Sullivan successfully killed his very first coyote using this exact unique method. When a coyote charged the coop at 30 miles per hour, Sullivan did not try to track the animal with his long rifle barrel. He picked a spot near the fence corner, raised his rifle, aimed at that empty space, and waited for the animal to come into view. The coyote ran in a straight, predictable line, intersected with the bullet path, and then dropped dead onto the cold ground. Over the next 4 years, the farm boy used this exact technique to shoot dead 47 coyotes on his family farmland. He never missed a single shot, and he saved every single chicken on the farm from those fast and hungry wild predators. His father never explained the complex physics behind the trick. He just said that it worked every single time they tried. But Sullivan intuitively understood the logic that a running animal trajectory is actually very stable and predictable. If you pick a fixed point on its path, the animal will arrive at that specific location at a very specific moment in time. If your bullet is waiting at that exact spot, at that exact moment, you will get a hit and the target will be destroyed. It was brutally simple and highly effective. It required absolutely thorough, complex mental math for the young farm boy. Standing on a freezing airbase in England watching gunners die because of complex math, Sullivan had a huge revelation. What if gunners stopped calculating lead and instead picked a fixed point in the sky and let the German fly into lead? In September, he pitched this idea to a gunnery officer, but he was harshly reprimanded and dismissed by the high command. Officer cited that this violated every basic principle of fire control doctrine, which requires tracking the target. He was told you do not blindly fire into empty space, but coyotes did not care about military doctrine, and nor did planes. On the morning of October 14th, Sullivan brought a stopwatch and a notebook to the airfield to record the reaction. He was going to record the time window the gunners had to react and calculate distances to teach them to shoot coyotes. He swore by 4 in the afternoon that he would mathematically prove his farm boy logic was sound or watch more planes fall. The second Schwinn for trade started at 8:47 in the morning with 291 heavy bombers. There were 2,910 American airmen heading straight for the defended ball-bearing factories. Without ball bearings, Nazi tanks could not roll in the entire German war. A machine would finally grind to a complete halt. Standing on the observation deck, Sullivan could not fly, but he could listen to the brutal air war unfolding via radio. At 10:15 in the morning, the bombers crossed into German airspace with clear weather and a very tight formation. At 10:27 in the morning, chilling radio calls began as 50 German fighters were spotted high above the clouds. Sullivan clicked his stopwatch as the German fighters peeled off from 28,000 feet for a terrifying dive. The chatter on the radio turned into a chaotic symphony of heavy machine gun fire and the roar of screaming engines. Sullivan stared intently at the sweeping second hand while recording the exact duration of these high-speed aerial engagements. From the moment the enemy planes were in range until they finally broke off, it took a total of exactly 23 seconds. 23 seconds of continuous, desperate firing by hundreds of American gunners, yet not a single German plane was down. The Germans quickly reformed their ranks and launched a second wave using the exact same top-down and lethal frontal tactic. Through the static of the radio, Sullivan could hear the raw frustration and the pure terror in the voices of his students. They were racking, undaming, and leading and firing, just like they were taught, yet they were hitting absolutely nothing. Then came the damage reports as 3 B-17 bombers were hit and one was falling out of formation as the crew bailed out. Listening to the slaughter, Sullivan frantically scribbled in his notebook as he ran the numbers in his head once more. The German fighters were diving at 400 miles per hour, while the heavy B-17 bombers were flying at 180. That meant a relative closing speed of 580 miles per hour, or roughly 850 feet. The American gunners had a maximum of 3 seconds of engagement time before the enemy plane flew past their turrets. In those 3 seconds, the German fighter would cover exactly 2,550 feet of the cold sky. If a gun aimed directly at the plane, it would take the heavy bullet about 0.4 seconds to reach the area. But in that 0.4 seconds, the German plane had already moved 340 feet forward in space. The bullets would forever be chasing ghosts, hitting the empty air behind the enemy as the crews died in their cockpits. The manual demanded they aim 340 feet ahead, but judging that while shot, that was impossible. Staring at his geometric sketches, the truth hit Sullivan like a thunderbolt in that freezing English hour. If the gunner did not aim at the plane but at a fixed point 2,000 feet in front, the fizz exchanged. The enemy plane in its dive would cross that fixed point to 0.3 seconds before reaching the bomber. That meant the gunner had 2.3 seconds to unleash a stream of fire into that one specific space. The target would actively fly into the bullets, exactly like a coyote sprinting straight into a chicken coop. More bad news crackled over the radio as 15 bombers were damaged and 4 more were totally destroyed. Sullivan made his decision. He could not help the men dying now, but he could save those flying tomorrow. He had to teach them how to shoot coyotes and find someone with authority to bypass the military doctrine. At 4:23 in the afternoon, the survivors landed and 60 aircraft were gone forever. 620 men were lost, and the gunners who stumbled out were traumatized in hollow ghosts. Sullivan found Sergeant William Morrison, a veteran gunner who had just survived his 11th deadly mission. Morrison confessed his hit count was 0 despite following every single instruction in the official manual. He had burned through 800 rounds of ammo, achieving nothing while the German fighters slaughtered them. Sullivan asked if he wanted to learn a new way to shoot that required absolutely 0 lead calculations. Morrison initially thought the kid had lost his mind. He looked at his bullet-riddled bomber and asked, "Will this keep me alive?" Sullivan did not blink. Very likely. The math was flawless. Morrison agreed. The young staff sergeant's convictions weighed the veteran. Dying by the book was not doing him any good anyway. He was ready to try anything to avoid being another tragic number today. Imagine a deadly piece of machinery the size of a Volkswagen, armed and hurtling straight at you from 20,000 feet high. It is diving from directly above your windshield at a terrifying relative closing speed of over 600 miles per hour now. You are trapped in a glass bubble with barely 3 seconds to react before this machine tears you and your friends to pieces. Within this fleeting, impossible window, you must lock onto the target and perform a complex mathematical calculation in your head. If your calculations are off by even a fraction of an inch, it is not just your life. Every single mistake is a death sentence. The entire 10-man crew of your bomber will face sudden obliteration. The fortress will become a falling tomb of burning metal. This was the desperate, everyday reality for every American heavy bomber gunner flying in the freezing skies in 1943. The elite ace pilots of the German Luftwaffe seemed to have unlocked the ultimate cheat code for a brutal, one-sided massacre. Who could have predicted that the person who would shatter this deadlock was a 19-year-old farm boy from rural Kansas? Relying on a crazy trick he learned on his farm, he miraculously caused the destruction of 37 invincible German planes. This is a breathtaking, blood-pumping legend that has been buried by the dust of time, a hero who rewrote the rules of combat. Today, let us return to those skies filled with shrapnel and witness how a farm kid completely rewrote the history of combat. That night, Morrison gathered 5 more exhausted gunners in a dark hangar for a secret training session with Sullivan. Sullivan used a flashlight and a piece of heavy string to demonstrate the fixed-point concept to the skeptical men. The gunners were skeptical but desperate enough to listen to the 19-year-old farm boy from the plains of Kansas. He explained that the German pilots were as predictable as the coyotes he had hunted back in the rural Kansas fields. He told them to ignore the plane and focus on the empty space ahead of the formation to create a lethal lead wall. By 3 in the morning on October 15, 1943, 10 gunners had fully mastered the crazy trick. They agreed to keep it a secret from the officers to avoid being thrown in the stockade for violating military rules. The morning of October 15, 1943, arrived with the roar of engines for another deadly mission. Morrison and his crew climbed into their B-17, feeling a strange new sense of confidence despite the high risks. As they reached 20,000 feet, the first wave of German fighters appeared as tiny black dots on the horizon. Instead of frantically tracking the planes, Morrison locked his heavy guns on a fixed point in space as instructed. ABF screamed toward them, heading straight for the cockpit in a lethal and terrifying head-on attack. Morrison held his breath and squeezed the trigger, sending a continuous wall of lead into the empty void ahead. The German fighter flew directly into the stream of bullets and exploded into a massive ball of orange fire. For the first time in his career, Morrison had scored a kill within the first 3 seconds of the lethal engagement. Word of the successful kill spread through the airbase like wildfire that evening as the crews shared the great victory. Dozens of desperate gunners flocked to Sullivan's barracks that night, begging him to teach them the farm boy logic now. Within a few days, every single nose gunner in the squadron was practicing the new fixed point taming technique together. The results were immediate and shocking as German fighters began falling out of the freezing sky in very high numbers. The Luftwaffe pilots were confused because their head-on attacks were now meeting a wall of lead they could not escape. Sullivan eventually documented that his method was responsible for the destruction of 37 enemy planes in all. This simple trick from a Kansas farm effectively saved the lives of nearly 300 American bomber crewmen today. The official records were slow to change, but the men in the air knew exactly who had given them a real fighting chance. Sullivan continued to refine the technique using his stopwatch and notebook to track every single aerial battle again. He proved that intuition and common sense could defeat the most advanced military doctrines of the modern war period. By the end of World War II, the lead wall tactic had become an unofficial legend among many heavy bomber squadrons now. Raymond Sullivan returned to his quiet farm in Kansas after the war, but he never forgot the brave boys in the clouds. He lived a long and humble life while the story of his tactical genius remained a secret among the veteran air flyers. Today we remember the farm boy who looked at the most elite pilots in the world and saw only a pack of wild coyotes. His legacy lives on every time someone uses simple logic to solve an impossible problem during the heat of the battle. During the very next mission, after their secret training, the entire formation encountered a massive swarm of the F-fighters. Morrison and the other gunners did not panic, but held their heavy guns steady on the pre-minus calculated fixed points in the sky. As the Luftwaffe pilots dove for their typical head-on attack, they were met by a terrifying and solid wall of lead fire. 3 German fighters were shredded instantly, and the first pass and the rest of the interceptors broke away in total confusion. Word of the success spread to other bomb groups, and Sullivan continued to teach the farm boy logic to every new gunner he met. Over the next few months, the kill counts for the squadrons, board and the loss of heavy bombers began to drop significantly. Sullivan meticulously recorded every engagement, confirming that his method had saved at least 300 lives in the air. By the end of the war, he was credited with the destruction of 37 enemy planes through his unique lead wall tactic. Despite his incredible success, Sullivan remained humble and rarely spoke of his role in rewriting the rules of aerial combat. He returned to the family farm in Kansas, where he once again looked at the vast horizon that had taught him so much. The lessons learned from hunting coyotes on the plains had saved the lives of hundreds of boys in the skies over Germany. Sullivan's legacy is a testament to the power of common sense and the ability of a single mind to change the course of history. We must never forget the farm boy who looked at the most elite pilots in the world and saw only a pack of wild predators. His story remains a hidden gem in the history of World War II, a story of how simple logic defeated the laws of math. Today, we honor Raymond Sullivan, the strategist observer who saved his brothers and rewritten the very rules of the sky. The legendary zone fire tactic was adopted by the 8th Air Force, changing the defense strategy of every bomber squadron. During the Big Week in February 1944, the lead wall proved to be a nightmare for the brave Luftwaffe pilots. German interceptors found their precision head-on attacks blocked by a curtain of heavy lead that they could not outrun. In one single engagement over Regensburg, the improved gunnery tactics resulted in 12 confirmed kills for the squadron. Sullivan was promoted to Master Sergeant and received the Distinguished Service Medal for his genius tactical innovation. By the summer of 1944, the German Luftwaffe had largely abandoned the deadly frontal attack doctrine. Sullivan continued his work, refining the math until the very end of the war, saving thousands more of his young brothers. When the war finally ended in 1945, Raymond Sullivan quietly packed his notebook and headed for home. He returned to the family farm in Kansas, where the rolling wheat fields provided a peace he had long since forgotten. His story was rarely told in history books, but every veteran gunner knew the name of the boy who saved their lives. Sullivan lived a long and humble life, passing away peacefully in his farmhouse many decades after the Great War ended. His legacy lives on in the modern ballistics and strategic logic used by military engineers across the world today. We honor the farm boy who saw world-class pilots as Wild Coyote Sentry wrote the rules of survival in the sky. His story teaches us that even the most complex problems can be solved by looking at the world with fresh, simple eyes. If you want more hardcore breakdowns of history's deadliest miscalculations, smash that like button and subscribe now.